Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about braising and how to keep that flavor in your meats. Alright, so braising is simply when meat is cooked in a covered pot. This can be done with a small amount of water, or you can do a dry braise. When you do a dry braise, the juices from the meat help to create a wet environment, so you don't really need to add any water to it. And when you do that, the gravy that comes from it is really, really good because you don't have the water to dilute the flavor. Um, Doing a dry braise, that normally works best with meats that have high levels of collagen, kind of like what we talked about last week with the pot roast and the steaks. They have high levels of collagen. That's basically the tough meats have high levels of collagen, which create the gelatin, like we talked about last week. Three advantages of braising. For one, the liquid does not go beyond 212 degrees, which provides for even cooking. Also, you can use that liquid to make a sauce, and also the steam helps to cook, so the cooking time is reduced. It doesn't take as long for the meat to cook when you have that steam to help cook it. Just a tip: in order to get some extra flavor on your meat, you can sear it first in a pan. I like to put, when I'm gonna sear my meat, I normally put it on about 7 or 8 on the stove, and then just it only takes a few seconds, probably about 10 seconds, to brown each side, and that gives you some added flavor to your meat. So there are two types of braising we're going to talk about: pot roasting and stewing. Pot roasting is simply large meats cooked in a small amount of liquid, just like this picture down on the right bottom. I'm sure you've all eaten pot roast. You've seen it in a slow cooker. It's like a big piece of meat and with a little bit of liquid at the bottom, and then you put that over gravy. By the time you're done, there's more liquid because of the juices that came from the meat. And then there's also stewing, which is this picture here, which is just simply small pieces cooked in more liquid. So instead of having one big old piece of meat sitting in a little liquid, you cut up the meat and have it cooking in or stewing in a bunch of liquid. Alright, so we're going to talk about flavor, about the things that add flavor to your meat. One thing you might not have known is that bones contain a lot of flavor. And that's because the bones actually contain the collagen that would turn to gelatin, which adds to the flavor of the meat and the sauce that comes from the meat when you're cooking it. Also, the bones are lined with fat, which can absorb flavor from the smoke, and the marrow also contains flavor that can flow throughout the meat. Slow cooking adds flavor to your meat because it gives time for all the seasoning to really cook into it. Then one last thing we're going to talk about is the Maillard reaction, which is simply searing your meat, basically. And it's heating foods at temperatures of at least 300 degrees. And basically what's happening when you sear your meat or brown it, or when the Maillard reaction is taking place, is new flavor compounds are being made. When it hits that hot skillet like that and that brownie comes, those are new flavor compounds that are being made that weren't there before. If you have any, you want to make sure you have a dry skillet. If you have any amount of liquid in the skillet or the pot when you're browning your meat, is going to affect that reaction because the temperature is going to be reduced. And like I said, it has to be at a temperature of at least 300 degrees. Okay, and the last, just a few extra things. Something I read in there that was interesting. You can brown your meat in the oven. If you're gonna do that, you want to let the meat sit first so that the internal temperature can be reduced, and then you want to put it back in the oven at a high temperature, probably like 450, between 450 and 500, for 10 to 15 minutes. If you don't let it sit first, then putting it in the oven for that 10 to 15 minutes on that high temperature like that would dry out the meat. So that's if you want to brown your meat in the oven. Just a little note I put on the side: browning is caused by molecules called melanoid and pigments. Um, Just something else extra. The drippings used from the bottom of the pan when you're cooking meat is called fond. So I don't know if you ever watched your parents cook. They might be cooking like steaks or something like that in the pan, and those brown bits get stuck on the bottom of the pan. Well, if you add just a little bit of liquid, scrape it up, mix it together, that's called fond. When you can make that sauce from those drippings like that. And then the structure of meat, something I also found pretty interesting, is simply muscle fiber, water, connective tissue, and fat. So that's what makes up meat: muscle fiber, water, connective tissue, and fat. And I believe that is the end of that. Yep. So once again, with this, I'm gonna give you certain page numbers to read in that book that correspond with what was talked about in here. Is gonna go into more detail than what I did, so I want you to go and read that. Also, like I said before, be practicing putting the stuff that you're learning into play. Help your parents cook, or ask if you can cook one day, so you can remember these things that you're learning from this video. Alright, that is all.